Good evening, all, and welcome to another installment in the, in our discussions. Welcome to another installment in our discussions about leadership, about people development, about what it takes for organizations and individuals to be successful. And this evening, we are going to be talking to you about systems thinking. For those of you who do not know, my name is Marjorie Wharton. So, welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. And my colleague is the one and only Sonia Layne. Yeah, I like that, Sonia. There's a nice little enthusiasm going on there. And as always, we come together because we are coaches, we are a leadership development specialists. Sonia also specializes in the area of diversity and it's DEI,
Equity,
diversity,
DEI,
equity, and inclusion.
and change.
And and
We
she,
are
well,
both.
we both work on change and we work on strategic development. But a lot of what we have found over the years is that there needs to be a real focus on individuals, on people, on leaders. And while you have to have systems that work well, you really have to have a perspective from the individual that is going to really set the foundation for the organization and how it runs. And so we decided to come together, have these discussions, offer you our insight, our experience, give you a forum for you to share your questions with us and share your feedback as well. And so today our topic is why leaders need systems thinking. So
Mhm.
Sonia, what are your opening comments?
Well, my opening comments are generally you can't be a leader if you don't understand how systems work and you don't understand what it takes to change systems. That's such an essential part of being successful as a leader when it comes to change, transformation, when it comes to accomplishing goals. So I feel like, when we talk about limitless leader, this is such an important foundation, a brick in the wall, a brick in the house, whatever analogy you want to talk about in terms of being a limitless leader.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we started the discussion. For those of you who've not seen it, you can check out the recording. But we started the discussion last month. Well, in our last session, we were talking about limitless leader and what it takes in order for a limitless leader to be successful. And
Mhm.
when we were exploring what our next topic could potentially be to build on that first set of discussions, we really identified this as the key thing that we believe limitless leaders are going to have to know. If you want to be successful and you want to achieve everything, you have to consider the system as a whole. So, for those who don't know, when we're talking about systems thinking,
Mhm.
we're really talking about that holistic approach to looking at organizations, to
Mhm.
looking at entities that work, and to really understanding in a big picture way how things come together, how they connect, and how movements in any one part can impact the other. And so, our intention today is really to talk about the value that these have in organizations, the value that systems have, and
Mhm.
secondly, the application of systems thinking to creating transformation in organizations, and then ultimately some skills that leaders need to have in order to practice systems thinking effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the plan. All right. So what would you say is the value of systems thinking? And Sonia, I'm starting with you because I know you made a post on LinkedIn. So if you haven't seen it, folks, go check it out. But you
Yes.
put a post up on LinkedIn about an example of systems thinking gone awry, or maybe an absence of systems thinking in an organization.
Mhm.
And I think from what we've been doing over the years, we probably both have lots of examples of that. But tell us a little bit more about yours. Maybe everybody listening hasn't seen it.
So I was thinking about a change project that I was brought into where the manager had changed lunch hours by 5 minutes and
Mhm.
then had like a staff, right on hand. And that was such a highlight of what, when you go in and you make changes, you don't understand that systems are interlinked, people are interlinked. And when you change one part of the system, regardless of
Mhm.
how small it is, it has ripple effects, because that really impacted people's ability to pick up their children. It impacted when everyone organized to ensure that they were at lunch. They weren't at lunch when their clients were calling. It impacted people's ability to connect and get things done. It just upended the system, and that was basically because no one asked the question: what happens when I do X? Right?
Mm-hmm.
We in organizations, we tend to something goes wrong and we think, okay, we need to fix it, and we fix it, and it has unintended and unanticipated question result consequences.
Consequences. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so the value of system thinking is that it helps you to problem solve much more effectively, because it gives you an understanding of what's going to happen, what could be potential consequences of the actions you're taking. It helps you to make decisions much better and in a much more knowledgeable way. And so, because when you understand that interconnectedness of the different parts of a system or a process, when you're problem solving, when you're making decisions, you're going to do it much more in a much more informed way, and your
Mm-hmm.
results are going to be much better. So I think that's one of the first values of systems thinking. You get better
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
problem solving and decision making.
Yeah, and as someone who works with leaders when they're trying to think strategically, it is an important part of that process, because just as you said, if you're going to make a move in one area, what is the impact that it's going to have in another area, even outside of the organization? One of the things that we often need to consider or remember is that organizations are open systems. And so I think if we can think about apply systems thinking to organizations and see it that way, then we recognize that what happens in the organization has an impact on what's going on outside. And of course, what's going on outside has an impact on what's going on inside. A lot of times leaders like to say that employees should leave their private lives at home, and whatever has happened, they should not bring it into the organization. But that is inevitable, because there's no way, there's no switch that we flip when we cross the threshold of the organization and we don't bring whatever's happened outside into it. So whatever is going on out there, the demands in other organizations for changes in labor conditions, the industrial relations negotiations that's going on at an organization, even though yours is not industrialized, you don't have a union, it doesn't mean that it's not going to have an impact on what's going on in the organization. And so you need to consider all of these things, as you said, Sonia, with any decision that is being made. I also think that systems thinking allows you to see also if the organization has a rigid system or one that is flexible. And for example, an organization that the fact that changing the lunch hour by 5 minutes has such a huge impact on so many people suggests that they are operating with a lot of rigid systems. And if you are thinking about that, then you begin to realize, okay, we can't do that here, because
Hmm.
it's not a situation where, because there are many organizations to change the lunch hour by 5 minutes, by 15 minutes would have made no difference, but in that particular scenario, so it's not easy enough. And a lot of leaders may often say, well, they did it at AB company, so we can do it at ours. It's never that simple.
Hmm. And I think
Mhm. Go ahead.
organizations understand that, because when you look at people, or leaders make decisions and say this, what's happening in the macro world impacts our ability to hire. It impacts our ability to get growth. So I think they understand it. It's just that they want it to be selective. And so here's where we're
Good
saying
point. That's a
it
good
is
point.
not a selective.
It applies
um,
all the time.
it applies all the time. And I love that point that you're just talking about a rigid systems,
Mhm.
because my husband just came back from the library, and when he's thinking, he's in deep thought, he closes his
Mhm.
eyes as he's doing. My husband's a mathematician, he's doing proof,
Mhm.
and the library person came up behind him and jumped him
Mhm.
because he had his eyes closed. And he said, well, why would you? Because they're required to check on you, to do a wellness check with anybody in the library who has their eyes closed.
Ah.
It's like, I'm thinking.
See?
Now you and I know
Yeah.
people who close their eyes when they're listening, who close their
Yes, of
eyes when
course.
they're thinking, close their eyes for a number of reasons. But and so he's upset because obviously, somebody sneaking up behind you and jumping you when you're in deep thought.
Yeah.
The point of it is to be a wellness check, but that was not delivered. The result of that is not
Yeah.
oh, I'm thinking of your wellness. And so when he said to the manager, well, why is this? They said, well, that's just the rule that we have to apply. Anybody who closes their eyes will will be subjected to,
Mm.
because this is not for your benefit, subjected to a wellness chat. And they can't
Yeah.
change it because that's the system. Very rigid, and as a matter of fact, if you close your eyes in here, we will ask you to leave. And so, yeah, there are certain, and when you have a system, an open system, and when you're dealing with the public, when you're dealing with customers, such rigidity suggests this is going to be problematic.
Of
Right.
course.
And so I really do love that point, that when you talk about the whole fact of the systems are open, and it means that you have to be flexible, particularly if you're going to be changing. And if you have so much rigidity in your systems, then
Hmm.
for people who are saying, well, we are always talking about change, but it never happens, this may be a reason why.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And particularly then, because one of the points that I have coming up later on is talking about power and power dynamics in the system. Because the reason why, if you have a very rigid system, so one that's not responsive or one that cannot adapt based on the demands of the environment, then you're going to have that resistance as well, because there are going to be power connections and power relationships at play
Mm-hmm.
that have developed to support the existing system. Your
Ooh.
attempts to come in and make any adjustments, any tweaks, because oftentimes when we're making changes, we think seeing it as a tweak, but sometimes your little tweak in one area has a huge ripple down the road, like an avalanche that started because you threw a pebble.
That's
So,
it. Yes, yes, that's it. If you don't understand systems thinking internally, because people understand it externally, they know if the economy gets tight, there's a hint of a recession. You just saw it. People, large companies with billions of dollars in the bank, used it as a reason to lay off a whole lot of people, right?
mhm.
But internally, it's the same thing. It's a ripple effect, and I love that analogy you just did, because those little simple tweaks that you're talking about, the tweak, we just tweak lunch hours by 5 minutes to deal with this issue, and then
Yeah,
it's a little pebble, and then it turns into an avalanche, and you're like, how did I get here based on one simple little thing? Yeah, that's
yeah.
why systems thinking is so important. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And so that's where I think that one of the biggest skills that any leader needs to have is that ability to do that kind of holistic thinking and to see interconnectivity, or the interlink, as you were calling it. Because if you're not able to see the connection between that part of the organization and this part, if you're walking along and you're just thinking about your department or your area or that one little thing that you're trying to solve, and you're not considering the impact on other areas, even sometimes something as simple, you say, well, I want to take care of my people in my department. Now, of course, you're doing a good thing, so you're taking care of
Mm-hmm.
your people in your department, but then what impact is it going to have on the rest of the organization? Now, it doesn't say that you should not take care of your people, but consider what can be done to take care of others.
Yes.
Because what happens as soon as you start to say that, well, yeah, I can't do that for you, because if I do it for you, everybody's going to want it. That is not the correct approach to take, leaders.
Yeah. You're not a senior leader
Right.
until you realize that you're interconnected. I mean, first of all, let me backtrack, because people realize we're interdependent, because when we go into organizations, we have to play politics. And we play politics because there are limited resources, not enough resources to go around, and we're interdependent. And so
Mhm.
as a result, you have to persuade, you have to cajole, you have to negotiate, and you have to really interact with people in order to get the resources you need for your department. So you
Mhm.
start there. You understand that you're not a senior leader until you recognize and take into consideration that interdependence when you're making decisions. And so I say that to when I'm coaching executives all the time. I'm saying, you're here, but you need to step up. And stepping up recognizes that, yeah, you've got your, just as you said, you've got your department down pat. You know how to deal with that. But you now have to start thinking holistically. And that's what the CEO normally does. The C-suite does that. But they need you at whatever level you are helping them. Rather than, we go off and we make all these big plans without considering the interconnectedness, without considering the system. And then when it gets to another level, it dies. It dies because you're not considering the system and doing systems thinking. And so whatever level you are at in an organization as a leader, the earlier you understand the value of system thinking in getting and accomplishing what you need to accomplish, the more successful you will be. Yeah.
I absolutely agree with that. It's just, as you were talking, I was saying, I think I hear you say more than once that we know that leaders know this, but I want to say I don't think all leaders know this.
You and I are always.
I know. I was going to say that.
Always at this. I'm always assuming. The problem they say with assumptions.
And but still, I appreciate the fact that you are operating from the point of view that leaders know this. But I want to say I'm not sure all do. Or maybe it is a case of knowing and not doing. So maybe they know it intellectually,
knowing, doing,
but they're not really applying it in the decisions that they're making.
And because, to be fair, because you're about to say the same thing.
That's how come you're then winding up with the example that you have of the 5-minute change. Because yes, you know about the system, but nobody really thought that would be a big deal because that was just a little tweak. It's only 5 minutes after all. I mean, how big an impact would that have? But I think if you had someone who was thinking about that, and I have an example, I had shared this with you when we were discussing. I have an example of a CEO who cut the organization staff in half, including removing 2 people who sat at reception. And then that happened on the Friday. And the Monday, there was a big query when they realized that the receptionist can't get up to go to the bathroom because there's nobody who has been assigned the responsibility to be rotated to sub for her when she has to get up and move. Now, systems thinking says that you would consider, if that happens, at least make sure that you've put somebody in place to be on standby for the call. But when the discussion was, well, who is going, the receptionist says, well, who's going to come to the front desk when I have to get up? It was stunned silence because it had not been considered. So while it is the individual, of course, is still thinking systems because they're thinking about, we have to reduce the number of employees we have in order to have a positive impact on the bottom line, in order for the organization to grow moving forward. So they are thinking about that. But when it comes to this little thing of how can the receptionist get up from that point to go to the washroom? How does she go to lunch? If she's taking a call, what happens to the customer that walks up the stairs? How is that going to be dealt with? Yeah. Nobody thought about that. So I would like to be as generous as you are and to say that you think all leaders are thinking about this, but I don't think we're there yet. I think it's still evolving.
You know what I think? And you see, and in that situation, when a leader feels overwhelmed, that's what they pass on. When they are inundated, they feel like they're drinking from a fire hose. It's not easy when you're out in fires and you're constantly in firefighting mode to think, first of all. And then systems thinking comes after you've thought. You have to go, oh, there's a whole system here and we have to deal with it. So I think for leaders, they're under pressure to deliver and they go for what we call low-hanging fruit. I don't know if it's low-hanging fruit, but I always say to people, you cannot budget cut your way to greatness. And that's the first thing leaders tend to focus on. It looks easy and it's a specious, I don't know, you think you're getting somewhere, but you're not. And then you get into those things. So I do have some compassion that when you're trying to figure out how do I get rid of certain expenses fast, then you go into mode of what do I need to do? I cut half the staff at the front desk. I cut people off and bring up their lunch hour by 5 minutes. So you then, and you're moving, you're building the runway as you fly the plane. And so it doesn't get you anywhere. And so that's why we're saying you have to spend time. And this is where the great leader comes. This is where the limitless leader comes, in understanding that even though I'm busy, I must at least spend 5 minutes thinking about how does this impact the other system. So yes, I assume that they know it, but they are so overwhelmed and so driven and so busy firefighting that it's difficult to do it. But you know, great leaders, it's difficult, but you find a way to do it. And that's what we're here to help. How do we find a way to do that? And so this is why we say it's valuable, make time for it.
And that's it. It's ultimately so important that you have to, regardless of how busy you are, regardless of the pressure that you're under, you have to consider it. And it often requires not just, as you've said, not just thinking about the next step, but sometimes thinking about the link that's 5 or 6 steps down the road. So the interconnectedness. And it has to involve, or it requires you as a leader to think, like if you were playing chess, to think 10 steps ahead, not just 1 or 2. It has, you have to get into that thing of saying, if, then, therefore. If I do this, then what will happen, therefore. And then once that happens, then what? Therefore. And do that for a couple of steps down the road. So that kind of if, then, therefore approach to thinking that you often have to do in order to really come up with a good solution is a critical tool for leaders to use as they are going about applying systems or applying any kind of transformation in an organization.
Yes, we're playing chess, not checkers. And I did a
excuse me,
on that.
As a player of checkers, I will have you know that it also requires strategic thinking. But you go on.
Yes, and it's also important, even if you can't, you know, because these are like minute changes. But if you're an organization, or you're dealing with change, if you're dealing with transformation, if you're trying to innovate, then strategic thinking is essential, you know, because that's what sparks your imagination and helps to reveal opportunities. You have to understand and really chart what are the systems and how do they come together, because you can chart the different segments of what make up the systems, but then how do they interact with each other and how do they interplay? That is really, really important if you're talking about growth and innovation. You gotta really, play with that system and see what the interconnections are, what and what interdependencies can be exploited. And so, even if you're really busy firefighting day in and day out, under no circumstances do you understand that if you are trying to engage in a change, in trying to engage in a transformation, and you're not thinking about the system, you're not systems thinking, then you're setting yourself up to fail, basically.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. So I think we talked quite a bit then about the understanding the value of the system. We started to talk a little bit then about how systems thinking helps when we are going through that process of making any kind of transformation. What maybe are some of the other things that we need to talk about or think about when we are applying transformation that systems thinking can help us to achieve or accomplish? I, of course, immediately think that an important thing in systems thinking is you have to understand people. You have to understand how the people are going to respond to the tweaks in the system. And of course, we know that having any kind of change or transformation happening in an organization, the people are the one thing you can never truly predict how they're going to respond.
I think you can predict how people will respond. I mean, we're change managers. We know that they're not going to be logical.
Isn't that saying the same thing? That's like saying the one thing you know for sure is that with change, there'll be change. So the one thing you know with people and change is that they're not going to be logical.
Okay, they're not going to be logical.
I agree with you. That's the one thing we know for sure. And it's because a lot of it comes from an emotional reaction.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, when we are in systems that are changing and things are changing around us, we have an emotional reaction to that change and the
Hmm.
new things we're being asked to learn, the new things we're being forced to now take responsibilities for. We don't think before we react. We have something that happens. It's like instinctive inside of us, and we have a feeling that comes up, and everything goes from there.
Yeah. Research does show that we're emotional people. We make decisions based on emotions. We like to think we're rational people and make decisions based on logic, but we don't.
Mhm.
80% of the time, it's the
Yeah,
emotions
we
of
make the
it.
emotional decision and then attempt to rationalize it. And as
Precisely.
somebody who's worked using marketing in organizations, that's the value. That's the valuable thing that all marketers know. Get the
Yeah.
emotions engaged and you win.
And you win. Yeah. And you can, you know, you can pull in people, you can exploit people. Yeah, it's something. It's serious when you study that or you read books about it. It's
Hmm.
crazy how we are, manipulated very easily.
Hmm.
However, when it comes to change, that's not something that we try to do within organizations.
But
We
interestingly, though, you should just not, you're not using it to exploit people, but you have to engage the emotions of individuals to get them to buy into change.
Yes. And I think that's the important part because there's so much complexity, there's so much turbulence going on in organizations today that the very first thing that you need to do when you talk about applying systems thinking in managing transformations, I think that's where we are, right?
Yes.
I think the first thing you need to do is you really need to map the system and figure out what it is because there are hidden aspects to that system that we
Hmm.
don't necessarily see. And that's what trips us up, right? And so we talk about why and the value of it, then you have to sit down and you really have to collectively map the system. What does it mean? So that you're the whole, the life system, and we always understand that systems, they're more than the sum of it, their parts. So
Hmm.
we tend to go into to leadership meetings and strategy, one dimensional thinking. We have the marketing, we have the finance, those silos that tend to happen in organizations just so naturally because we don't
Hmm.
we don't bother to pay so much attention to the systems, and so we act like we're independent of each other rather than we're being interdependent of each other. It's why so many people sit and say to marketing, the marketing aspect or the marketing arm of their organization, you're not helping me, this is
Hmm.
not helpful. You're not giving me what I want. And marketing sits and said, well, you need to tell me what you want. You're not giving me what you need, what I need to help you, because they don't see how they're connected. And so what you have to do is you have to sit and map that system, and so that you get and you sort of illuminate and crystallize what are the hidden aspects of that system that I don't see every day as it undertakes. And I think that gives you, once you start to tease that out with everybody,
Hmm.
playing a role, and you sit everyone at the table and utilize those days, because we deal with companies that their leaders are always constantly in meetings. Every single year they're constantly in meetings trying to figure out how to grow the business and every year the same result. The guests get low rather than getting better, they're getting lower and lower, and they're having longer and longer meetings. We need to talk more. But what are you doing when you're
Hmm.
talking? And this is where we say map that system so that you can see the hidden patterns, so that that can help you figure out why are we stuck. And
Hmm.
that's the beauty. That's how you apply the systems thinking, because those hidden patterns, those ones that you don't see, people always overlook how people will react to change.
Yeah.
Every time. You
Yeah.
and I, no, this is one where I know you and I, because we're in change, we know that the people side of change is one of the biggest factors that,
Hmm. Is the key
that,
to successful change.
yes.
Hmm.
But I don't know if I'm taking in, if like 80% of any change projects I take in, I'm always after the fact, after they
Hmm.
realize there's chaos and confusion here, and these people, the people are just not giving us what we need. And it's like, well, that's one of the hidden parts. Clearly it's a hidden part of your system. For us, it's glaringly obvious that When you think we need to, I need a change manager instantly, because
Mhm.
the moment I even start to frame the word change, I know I need somebody who understands that I need to figure out how do I get people to change, because change is hard. I'm a change manager
Mhm.
and I don't like change. I don't like it. It requires me to learn. It requires me to be uncomfortable, and and it requires a great big um, advantage for me to undertake it willingly.
Mm.
And people undertake change willingly all the time. We get married, we move, we change jobs, we do things, whether it's happy or
Mhm.
sad, change is still difficult, right? But we
Yeah,
need a reason for doing it. And so
absolutely.
not mapping that systems, and the fact that they don't eat that most organizations and most leaders don't even realize that people are are going to be their biggest resistors, tells us that they're not mapping their system. They don't understand their system, and they don't see patterns that come about and hidden, and it's why they're stuck.
Okay. So a good tool there that you've mentioned, that stakeholder mapping. That
Mm-hmm.
sorry, that systems mapping. And then the next thing I would suggest is that stakeholder assessment.
Mm,
Because as you do the system mapping, as you identify how your system works and you see where the connections are, you need to have an understanding of your stakeholders. So who are the people who benefit from this? Who are the people who have an impact on it? And that is why I mentioned the power issue, because there are some people in a system who have no power and they're only the responders. And so they're not the ones who are clogging up the system. When you start to realize that as you map it, you're seeing problems happening here and there. But you can only identify that as you start looking at the system as a whole and you start to consider, well, what exactly is causing this issue that I'm seeing over there? We've been trying to make this transformation or this change in the organization for the last 6 months, and nobody's buying into it. And it's because that particular area never does. Well, then why? And are they really the problem, or are they only the responders, whereas the power rests somewhere else? So, as you are doing your mapping, consider your stakeholders, consider who has the power in those amongst those stakeholders. So, who are the decision makers, who can create the resistance, who can slow the system, who can create the bottlenecks. All of those elements go into making sure that your system can shift and can accommodate the changes or the tweaks that you're
yeah.
hoping to make at one point in the system to then have an impact further on.
And that comes up so much when I'm doing DEI, because with DEI, first you have to understand the environment in which people are in, the systems, what are the patterns, and then the stakeholder and who has power. Because within DEI, it's really DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is really about how do we share power equally. And people with power don't like to share it, but they don't know that. It's a very instinctive, subconscious. Hold on a
Reaction.
minute. Yeah.
Mm.
It's everything, like it's not that people don't like change. They don't like not being in control of it, right? It's the same thing. You give people control, you give people power. They don't like you taking it away. None of us do.
Mhm.
And DI, that's the very same thing. The hidden patterns are the people who have power don't necessarily want to give up that power.
Mm.
And the people who want things, it's like when we say people want things to change, but they don't want to do anything different. They just want
Mhm.
things to get better. And
Mhm.
so that's where, as I see a comment here saying pivot psychology. I'm not familiar with that, so you might need to share more on that. But yeah, and that's the thing with DEI is like when you go in, the first thing you have to do is map these systems, understand the systems and the patterns and the interconnectedness of what's going on. And then that stakeholder mapping to see who has power, because they're the ones most able to change the system, right?
Mhm.
People have power collectively. So if everyone collectively resists subconsciously, but sometimes what you have are people really want that change. People really do. But the people with the power, if you don't know who they are and figure out how to bring them on board, then you're not going to get that transformation that is
Yeah.
needed to make the organization better.
Yeah. And what happens in a lot of systems, because if you consider most organizations, you often have more people who are powerless to impact the system.
Mhm.
And so if you see that the system isn't working, they're not the problem. But then what organizations will often do is target them as the ones that they're going to try to get them to change
Mhm.
behavior. And they're not focusing on the real people who really can have an impact on
Yeah.
the system.
And
And
let's bring it
so,
home and say
go
not
ahead.
organizations, leaders. That's who because we want to create more limitless leaders, people
Yeah.
who are not limited by the status quo. So leaders, yes, you tend to you can't you feel powerless because you don't know how to change the system. You're benefiting from the system, quite frankly, and you don't know how to change it. And so you spend more time silencing the voices of those who are being damaged by the system or harmed by the system than actually investing in the long-term effort of changing the system. Yeah.
Hmm. And whereas, as I said earlier, I know that you are very hopeful and very positive about the fact that a lot of those leaders are aware. I think that a lot of those leaders are not aware that the problem is the system. They're very
Mm,
quick to blame the people.
that's true. Yeah. I always
And
think people know these things, but you are right because sometimes you don't realize you have a problem until it's highlighted for you. So I always like love when you remind me of that, Marjorie, because it's true.
And so you will find that there are many times where leaders will say, and we know the research has shown that if you really think about it in organizations, often the processes, the procedures, the whole system by which the organization operates, the majority of the time, 85% of the time, that's the problem, not the people that you've put into the system. Because in a lot of those systems, oftentimes 60 to 70% of those people do not have the power to impact the system. The few people who have the power to impact the system, if they are not aware that the power resides with them, then they operate like I am powerless and I can't say anything. And so,
That
as one who's always say that revolution doesn't start at the top, I'm trying to get the powerless masses to share their voices with the people who have the power so that they could try to convince them to see things differently. And so I think it is really there are a lot of people who are in the positions of power who can impact the system who just don't recognize one, the power that they have, and they don't recognize, as you say, that they can change the system.
Mhm. And it's because you're benefiting from it. When you're
Right.
benefiting from something and you're absolutely there are hidden patterns that you're not seeing. And that's why we say you have got to map the system and
Mhm.
understand it so you can reveal those hidden patterns. You're trying Leaders often are trying to manipulate a system that they have no
Mhm.
understanding of, and
Mhm.
then that's when the unintended consequences or impacts shock them, because they you can't map it. That's the first thing a change manager does when we come in, is to figure out, well, what change are you trying to make, what is the system that you have, and what's the impact of those changes. Who's going to
Mhm.
feel like you're taking something away from me? Who's going to feel, no, you're pitching me from fully fully feeling competent into incompetency because this is something new now that I will have to change. And people resist that because it takes a lot of effort to get over the hump to learn something new. And
Mhm.
so it's really, really important. And you're so right. People don't understand the system, so they don't. So that's why they don't think that I can change the systems, because sometimes they don't think the systems need changing. Just the way that we're operating within them needs changing. I know
Mhm.
that sounds crazy. How
No,
are you gonna
that's the truth.
operate differently within the same systems? The system has to change, and that's
Mhm.
why you get systemic inequities, because the system is there. It's like, if you have, you know, you and I grew up in neighborhoods where somebody's land doesn't have a house on it, and people
Mhm.
will walk across the land to get to another side of the road. And then
Mhm.
eventually a path, right there, the grass doesn't grow because it's constantly trampling up it. And then someone comes to wants to put a house there, and it's like, hey, hold on a minute. No, you can't. That's our, we have been doing that for so long. That's where we're going. And even if, for example, you come build another road, people are going to go back to the path that they know, the path that they're comfortable, because they
Mhm.
don't have to think. To change the way you do something requires a significant investment of time and thinking. Think about if you're trying to lose weight or you're trying to adopt more healthy habits. Think about if you're just trying to go to bed early, how much effort
Yeah.
that takes, because naturally we just fall into that rhythm, what we call autopilot. And so if you're a leader and you don't understand that if you want your people to do something different, then the systems in which they operate, those you need to touch. And that if you touch those, understand it will impact the whole system. So you have to really pay attention to what that means by touching them. If you don't get this, then you're going to be sitting there stuck, trying to get growth when there's no growth, telling us that you can't find good people, that people
Mm-hmm.
just don't work hard like they used to before. No, it's that you're not focusing where you need to be. You're limiting yourself, and you need to be
Mm-hmm.
a limitless thinker and start without that systems thinking.
Yeah. And I think that's key because as we talk about leaders, and we know that a key part of leadership is really understanding the people side. So, understanding the people who work with you and so on. It is important to know that you have to create an enabling environment for people to be successful. That's part of what it means to be an enabling leader. And so part of creating that enabling environment is to make sure that you don't have a system that is set up to ensure that people fail. If you have a
Unintentionally
system,
fail. Yeah.
yeah, you have a
Mm-hmm.
system that it doesn't create and it doesn't support, it doesn't give the opportunity for people to try and learn new things. But you say you want to create a learning environment, or you want to create a learning and development or innovation, any of those things that we like to say, those lovely buzzwords that we like to run around with every now and again. But you're not creating systems that say, or you're not creating an environment that says, well, when someone does this and they fail, they are not condemned and they don't have a target on their back for the rest of their career with this organization and deemed as a failure. But instead, that failure in that trial is seen as part of the process, it is seen as learning, and it is seen as a way of moving forward. And so I would say that another tool or another way that has to be considered as we're talking about how you apply this systems thinking to organizations, you have to see that the organization is a learning organization.
That's one of the skills that I have for what is system thinking skills. Yes, because
Yeah.
you mentioned, so there's two things you mentioned there. So you talked about, well, go on and finish the continuous learning and adapting, because I think that's so important. That's such an important skill for a leader. So continue with that one.
I was pretty much there, but learning is
Okay. So
creating the learning organization for me is just what you've said. It is about creating that continuous learning and continuous development. But the key aspect of creating a learning organization starts with the recognition that you focus on the learning one that can be created. Two, you have to have effective systems for managing the knowledge that's in the organization. You have to have a system that says, yes, if we make a tweak over here, it's going to have an impact over there. What can we learn from that? How do we create a consequence or an output from what happens over there that
yes,
then helps us to go forward and to keep learning. Because a learning organization really has an orientation, just as you've said, Sonia, about the continuous learning, continuous growth.
mm-hmm.
It focuses on seeing learning in everything that it encounters. So
Yes,
if you are going to think about systems, then you have to think not just about keeping the one system you have running, but you have to think also about when something happens and it has an impact. What do we get from that so that we can keep moving this system forward so that we can adapt and we can transform?
yes, yes. And because that's one of the skills that I'm thinking that as a leader, limitless leader, that's what you need for strategic thinking. You need to be able to identify and analyze feedback loops. So first of all, that means you have to know there must be a loop in there. I've got to
Mhm.
figure out where I can find feedback loops that tells me when I make a change here, what it's telling me, and then you need to be able to analyze it. And the reason why you want those identifying and analyzing those feedback loops is so that you can continuously learn and adapt. You can figure out what are the mistakes that I've made, what can we learn from this, how can we adapt to changing circumstances. And if you don't have a feedback loop, then you're in trouble. You're always going to be, and I know there are leaders out there that always feel they're one step behind, and employees that always feel this organization is always one step behind. We're lurching from, we're not pivoting, we are not adapting, we are not agile, we are lurching heavily, slowly, always too late from one point. By the time we decide that we need to change, we've already missed the opportunity. And so even though we have been changing a lot, you know,
It's
leaders,
like you're still not catching up.
you're not getting anything. And then people, and then what happens as a leader is that your people are have change fatigue. I'm just tired. All you constantly talk about is changing here, changing there. You're like, but you need to be agile, you need to be adaptive. No, it's because you have not identified or able to analyze your feedback loop. So you're lurching from place to place, thinking you're pivoting, but you're not, right? You're slowing down, and you're just giving people getting people tired. They're exhausted from having to crank up with your inspiration speeches and trying to move quickly. We're gonna be the best we've ever been this year, and everybody goes, yeah. We've heard that before.
This again?
That's it, Marjorie. This again. So I think that's two really important skills when you talk about strategic thinking. When we say that you have to sit and you have to map the system, which means that you got to break down silos. Can't map a system with just you. It has to be every single person coming in and not battling, not saying it's us versus you, but understanding. Like we say, we use that comic where, you know, there's a boat and people are at one side, you know, there's a hole at one side, and they're trying, and the other people are laughing, because lots of organizations operate like that. Like you're not all in the same boat. You are. And so when you're sitting down and you're mapping it and you're trying to eliminate those hidden patterns that constantly cause you to fail, that constantly cause you to be slow, it means that you have got to have a feedback loops in there that tells you that you can test that when you're stress testing, when you're thinking what's happening, they're going to tell, and you're able to analyze them and then utilize those for learning. So you're not blaming people, you're not shaming people, you're not humiliating people. You're gleaning information and you're teaching your people that it's not about shaming here. It's about, did we learn something? If we did not learn something, then it was an error that we could have avoided. How do we ensure that this does not repeat itself again? Because there's a difference between making an error and making a mistake that you learn from. We want to reduce errors. We really want those learning mistakes that we can glean something from and we can gain something from. So yeah, I really love that, which is why I'm passionate about it.
And so I think that we are, I want to say, I'm agreeing with you. I think we're both passionate about the same thing when it comes to systems thinking and trying to apply it in the area of change, because our experience has shown that if you're going to have any kind of successful change or transformation, that you need to see the big picture. You can't just focus on the small area that you are seeing right in front of you, but you need to consider that wider and that bigger picture
thing. Yes.
Yeah.
And if we're into the section where we're talking about what skill sets do you have to develop, and we already, of course, at the beginning develop, then you got to understand the big picture. So I'm not going to assume that everyone knows that, Marjorie. Proud of me. I am going to state it because there are some, as a leader, some people are very good at the big picture and poor at going into the weeds. And some people are very good at in the weeds. And in the weeds is where things get done. So you need both, right? Either, but as a leader, if you're not good at the big picture, at seeing this entire system or mapping that, of understanding the interconnections, then you need to develop that as a skill set. And really grow. Marjorie and I are developing a Patreon where we're going to help people with to develop these types of skills, which are so essential to being a limitless leader. But that's the assumption, the foundation, that you have to get better at it, and it is a skill set that you can develop. This is not something you're just born with or not born with. You develop it. Yeah.
Right. And I'm smiling because I have that actually as one of the skills here, that ability to have that strategic thinking, that interconnection and that holistic thinking. So once again, we are, on the same page.
Yeah.
And then I
Okay.
would say that as I'm looking
Thank you.
here, that another one of the skills that I had mentioned or that I had noted down was really the ability to communicate in such a way that you can engage people. Because
Mm,
an important part, and particularly when we are talking about the application of systems thinking to transformation management, you may never get everybody else to think about the
mhm,
system as a whole. So you can't necessarily get people's minds to work that way because not everybody thinks that way. But once you have done it and you have found that there is a certain awareness that people need to have or things they need to consider that they're not taking into consideration, then it becomes your responsibility to start communicating that to others. Because the reason why a lot of people aren't doing it is because they don't see it. So
Yeah.
we're saying, as a limitless leader, you need to build the skill to be able to see it, and you need to have the skill to tell other people about it.
And you know why? Because you can't engage and understand a system without collaboration. Without other people, you can't do it alone, right? You just can't do it alone. Collaboration and communication is so, and I know that. Oh, somebody wrote well said. Thank you, Peter. We appreciate you saying that. We don't know when you said it, but thank you. um, what it's so hard. We talk like
Mhm.
you and I. We're saying the same thing, and we say it differently.
Yeah.
And then we come around to, but that's a skill set actually, that the fact that
Mhm.
we it's not antagonistic between us, because we understand that even though we may be arguing, but we understand that we come together then to realize we're saying the
Mhm.
same thing, just saying it differently. And so
Right.
when you're communicating, and if you're operating as a leader on the assumption that you have not communicated until the other person have understood,
Mhm.
not that they've heard, but that they've understood, then you understand why we continuously say to people that you have to work on communication skills,
Yeah.
because it is so difficult. People hear things, people interpret things. When you're talking to people, they're pulling it through their own lens and their own perspective. And so to get to you cannot get to collaboration until you've gone through communication. You could probably get to cooperation, where I
Mm.
tell you what to do and you do it. But true collaboration, which is needed to
Yeah.
reduce silos, that is needed to understand the system, you talk about it all the time, but you cannot do it without communication. A skilled
Yeah.
communicator is so essential.
It's
Yeah.
an essential skill for all limitless leaders to have. And we're going to talk about that more and more as we talk about the skills that they need to build. Not this
Mhm.
evening, however, because I'm noting that we only have 4 minutes remaining in this discussion
Oh,
time.
well, because you were saying, I
Go
want to
ahead.
say that as a limitless leader in strategic thinking, one of the great things that you need to build is how to do trade offs. Because
Mm.
that's why the communication, the collaboration, the understanding that you're not a leader until you start to consider the other aspects of the system, because that enables you to negotiate and do trade offs really well.
Mhm.
And to negotiate, and to play politics. Again, if you are a leader and you're like, I don't like to play politics, then listen, there are limited resources in the organization. The organization needs to go to head together. You therefore have to sit down and figure out, how can we get to win-win solutions? And that's playing politics right there. And so
Mhm.
that's really, really important skill that needs to happen. I know you don't like to hear it, but we're here to tell you the truth and make your life easier. And
No, but
so get
remember,
skilled at that.
we are operating on the assumption that everyone who is listening to us is interested in hearing what we have to say. So that's all right. Even though it
Oh,
might be a
okay.
little bit of a painful pill, sometimes we know that the people are interested in hearing what we have to say. So I think
Oh,
that we have covered some key tools and key areas and key things about systems thinking that any leader should remember. We talked about the fact that we need to have that systems mapping. You have It's almost like that's your starting point because you need to understand systems. If you're
Your
going to try to
environment.
make the change, you need to
Mhm.
check for the stakeholders, how they are connected, how they are being engaged. You need to understand power dynamics. You need
Mhm.
to, you talked about, I talked about communication. You talked about the fact that it leads to successful collaboration.
The
We
feedback loops.
we talked about the fact that the feedback loops, because if you're not getting information coming back at you to inform the system, to ensure that you are understanding the impact of what's happening, you're not going to be successful in creating learning organizations.
Those
And that
hidden
is the key part.
patterns, yes, are really the key
Right.
to
And
getting out. Hmm.
absolutely. So I would say that we would suggest that for all of you to continue to understand, if you've not already understood, or to continue to investigate. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. Investigate how you can utilize systems thinking if you're not already doing that. And if you are doing it, consider it more. Recognize that always there will be an impact for any change that you're going to make, anything that you're going to tweak. Understand also sometimes the impact that's happening to you is the result of a system change that has been made somewhere else. And so you may be powerless to affect it, but at least you can have an understanding of why it is happening. So I
Hmm.
think that's my closing comment, Sonia. What would be yours?
I will 100% agree. Thank you for the comment. They say really enjoying this. The compliment is
Yes.
for
Thank you
most of the
very much,
convo.
Peter,
Thank
for your
you.
feedback.
Yeah. Um, if you really want to invest in yourself and really upgrade your leadership skills and become a limitless leader, systems thinking is one of the key ways that you can get exponential growth and results with just focusing on this area. Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you. And so please follow us on LinkedIn or on Instagram.
Yes,
As Sonia
follow
mentioned,
us.
we are going to be launching a community on Patreon, and we want you to be a part of it because we want you to share your comments, share your insight with us. And we want to be able to continue this discussion and to offer more as we go on developing limitless leaders. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session.
Next month.
Bye.
Bye. Woohoo.